So with that, I'd like to give the floor to Maria to talk to us about how much of an outrage it is that Cuba is being elected to the council.
Thank you. Thank you for those words. Thank you for being here and for caring about the people of Cuba. Sadly, we've documented just a few thousand of what we think are probably dozens more, thousands of people killed in Cuba. But this is a systematic work, and please see the database. Each record has all the sources, circumstances, etc. It's hard to explain in 5 minutes why it's shameful that a criminal totalitarian dictatorship is elected to the United Human Rights Council and given a seat there. A state that violates, both in its laws and practices, essentially all applicable articles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So I took some notes because it's very hard in 7 minutes or 5 minutes to go through all the amazing abuses that Cuba perpetrates, not only on its people, but on the people around the planet in different regions of the world. Freedom House, the Washington, D.C. NGO, ranks Cuba, and this is a very systematic ranking of criteria, one of the least free countries in the world. And this is the only country in the Western Hemisphere that has that classification. And it's because in Cuba, the usurpation by the state of civil, political, and economic rights has few historic precedents. The almighty Cuban state is a one-party communist system under the absolute rule of one family that also owns and controls most of means of production. And the Cuban Constitution itself embodies the totalitarian nature of the system. I'll give you some highlights. Rather than guaranteeing the rights of the citizens vis-a-vis the state, Cuba's constitution does exactly the opposite. It concentrates power in the state and in the Communist Party, and in the most extreme forms. The people from which sovereignty is supposed to arise have no right to change their system or to amend the Constitution. Article 62 of the Constitution itself declares it limits the few rights that it actually concedes to the citizens by declaring that none of the constitutional rights may be exercised against the goals and laws of the socialist state or contrary to the construction of socialism and communism. Article 53, for example, also establishes that all press, radio, TV, movies, and all means of mass communication must be property of the state and in no case privately held. Not surprisingly, internet access is extremely restricted and censored, as is access to pretty much all information from abroad. And there are very good rankings of this that show that Cuba is one of the countries with the least access to internet in the world. Cuba's penal code, for example, is a tool for the exercise of repression. Among its many legal aberrations and ethical aberrations, Article 72, for example, criminalizes pre-criminal dangerousness with up to 4 years of prison. This is actually the proclivity of a person to commit a crime. There are hundreds of people, especially young men, in prison for this crime against the morality of the socialist state, which is interpreted very loosely for anything that can be threatening to the system. Many of these young men are dying in prison, and this is very hard to document. Article 103 of the Penal Code criminalizes any form of propaganda, verbal or written, and may be penalized with up to 8 to 20 years in prison. Article 2016 criminalizes leaving the country without the express authorization and prior authorization of the government to do so, which technically has turned Cuba into a gigantic prison for decades. Aside from the Constitution and the Penal Code, there are many other laws and legal aberrations. Just to select one, Law number 88 for the protection of national independence and the economy, commonly known as the gag law, penalizes with prison up to 20 years anyone considered to in any way support or collaborate with the U.S. blockade or the economic war against Cuba. This includes having any written material considered subversive to the economic interest of the state. And in 2003, it was applied to 77 members of civil society, independent journalists, independent librarians, that received sentences of around 20 years of prison. The Castro military dictatorship has been in power for over 57 years, and from its start has systematically committed wide-ranging crimes against humanity and repeatedly demonstrated its contempt for human life. And these crimes are not from the past, not from the mass executions of the 1960s, which instilled terror and implanted the system and paved the way for Stalinist repression. This is over time and continuing assorted extrajudicial killings, selective forced disappearances, widespread deaths in prisons for lack of medical care, suicide or alleged suicide, and a lot of the population is being pushed out of the country and also attacked by Cuban border guards, defenseless civilians, including children, for the crime of wanting to escape their country. This has no precedent, even among the bloodiest Latin American dictatorships. And for decades and to this day, Cubans have been systematically murdered for attempting to flee through embassies and through the US naval base at Guantanamo. While the infamous Berlin Wall fell 26 years ago, a deadlier replica, more than twice in age, remains in Cuba. Surrounding the US base at Guantanamo is an active minefield, and Cuban guards with orders to shoot. Countless hundreds, perhaps thousands, have paid with their lives, limbs, eyes, or years in prison for attempting this crossing. A huge and entrenched repressive apparatus exerts totalitarian domination, and for this there is always money. Repression and persecution against human rights defenders has been consistent over decades, but in fact has greatly intensified in scope and viciousness since Raul Castro became president and leader of Cuba 10 years ago. He was second in command until his brother Fidel fell ill in 2006. Regime agents routinely attack defenseless civilians, including women. Members of civil society are prevented from gathering and have their computers and personal property stolen. The Havana-based Cuban Commission of Human Rights reports that until the end of September 2016, for the year, it has documented at least 8,505 arbitrary detentions of peaceful opponents. Killing and disappearing inconvenient individuals is tragically part of the methodology of control. Many dissidents have been threatened with death, a few have been victims of suspicious accidents, others have been viciously attacked and survived to tell the story. Sadly, in the last 10 years of Raul Castro's tenure as head dictator, 12 human rights defenders have been killed or disappeared at the hands of state agents, some quite evidently, others in very suspicious circumstances. Finally, what is amazingly outrageous and very little known is that the Cuban state derives most of its revenue from the exploitation of its labor force, around $8 billion a year, in the export of temporary workers in conditions tantamount to modern slavery, and the forced migration of its people that brings in $6 billion a year just in assistance from the growing diaspora in the United States alone. It also runs a trafficking business deriving huge export revenues, millions of dollars annually in blood products and body parts donated by the citizens, subjected to intense campaigns to donate for humanitarian purposes and to save lives when this is actually used by the government to make profit in open violation of international ethical standards. So democratic countries that elect Cuba for the United Nations Human Rights Council have a short-term tunnel vision. They may think that appeasing Cuba or playing to its tune affords them protection and has little consequence. In fact, they are wrong to succumb to Cuba's gigantic machinery of global influence and propaganda. Eventually, these countries see their freedoms erode with Cuba's influence and participation, as we have seen in Latin America with the expansion of socialism, 21st century socialism that has gradually converted many of these countries into autocracies. And Cuba continues its alliances with rogue regimes, North Korea, Syria, Russia, China, to the detriment of global security and freedom worldwide. Thank you.